Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 4, The Borgias, Chapter 2. The world had now arrived at one of those supreme moments of history when everything is transformed between the end of one period and the beginning of another. In the east, Turkey; in the south, Spain; in the west, France; and in the north, Germany, all were going to assume, together with the title of great powers, that influence which they were destined to exert in the future over the secondary states. Accordingly, we too, with Alexander VI, will cast a rapid glance over them, and see what were their respective situations in regard to Italy, which they all coveted as a prize. Constantine, Palaeologos, besieged by 300,000 Turks, after having appealed in vain for aid to the whole of Christendom, had not been willing to survive the loss of his empire, and had been found in the midst of the dead, close to the Tophana gate. And on the 30th of May, 1453, Mohammed II had made his entry into Constantinople, where, after a reign which had earned for him the surname of Fatil, or the Conqueror, he had died, leaving 2 sons, the elder of whom had ascended the throne under the name of Bajazet II. The accession of the new sultan, however, had not taken place with the tranquillity which his right as elder brother and his father's choice of him should have promised. His younger brother, Djem, better known under the name of Zizama, had argued that whereas he was born in the purple, that is, born during the reign of Mohammed, Bajazet was born prior to his epoch, and was therefore the son of a private individual. This was rather a poor trick, but where force is all and right is not, it was good enough to stir up a war. The 2 brothers, each at the head of an army, met accordingly in Asia in 1482. Djem was defeated after a 7 hours' fight, and pursued by his brother, who gave him no time to rally his army. He was obliged to embark from Cilicia, and took refuge in Rhodes, where he implored the protection of the Knights of St. John. They, not daring to give him an asylum in their islands so near to Asia, sent him to France, where they had him carefully guarded in one of their commanderies, in spite of the urging of Qaid Bey, Sultan of Egypt, who, having revolted against Bajazet, desired to have the young prince in his army to give his rebellion the appearance of legitimate warfare. The same demand, moreover, with the same political object, had been made successively by Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, by Ferdinand, King of Aragon and Sicily, and by Ferdinand, King of Naples. On his side, Bajazet, who knew all the importance of such a rival if he once allied himself with any one of the princes with whom he was at war, had sent ambassadors to Charles VIII, offering, if he would consent to keep Djem with him, to give him a considerable pension, and to give to France the sovereignty of the Holy Land, so soon as Jerusalem should be conquered by the Sultan of Egypt. The King of France had accepted these terms. But then Innocent VIII had intervened, and in his turn had claimed Djem ostensibly to give support to the claims of the refugee to a crusade which he was preaching against the Turks, but in reality to appropriate the pension of 40,000 ducats to be given by Bajazet to any one of the Christian princes who would undertake to be his brother's jailer. Charles VIII had not dared to refuse to the spiritual head of Christendom a request supported by such holy reasons, and therefore Djem had quitted France, accompanied by the Grand Master d'Aubusson, under whose direct charge he was, but his guardian had consented, for the sake of a cardinal's hat, to yield up his prisoner. Thus, on the 13th of March, 1489, the unhappy young man, cynosure of so many interested eyes, made his solemn entry into Rome, mounted on a superb horse, clothed in a magnificent oriental costume, between the Prior of Auvergne, nephew of the Grand Master d'Aubusson, and Francesco Cibo, the son of the Pope. After this he had remained there, and Bajazet, faithful to promises which it was so much his interest to fulfill, had punctually paid to the sovereign pontiff a pension of 40,000 ducats. So much for Turkey. Ferdinand and Isabella were reigning in Spain, and were laying the foundations of that vast power which was destined 25 years later to make Charles V declare that the sun never set on his dominions. In fact, these two sovereigns, on whom history has bestowed the name of Catholic, had reconquered in succession nearly all Spain, and driven the Moors out of Granada, their last entrenchments, while two men of genius, Bartolome Diaz and Christopher Columbus, had succeeded, much to the profit of Spain, the one in recovering a lost world, the other in conquering a world yet unknown. They had accordingly, thanks to their victories in the ancient world and their discoveries in the new, acquired an influence at the court of Rome which had never been enjoyed by any of their predecessors. So much for Spain. In France, Charles VIII had succeeded his father, Louis XI, on the 30th of August, 1483. Louis, by dint of executions, had tranquilized his kingdom and smoothed the way for a child who ascended the throne under the regency of a woman. And the regency had been a glorious one, and had put down the pretensions of princes of the blood, put an end to civil wars, and united to the crown all that yet remained of the great independent fiefs. The result was that at the epoch where we now are, here was Charles VIII, about 22 years of age, a prince, if we are to believe La Trémouille, little of body but great of heart, a child, if we are to believe Comines, only now making his first flight from the nest, destitute of both sense and money, feeble in person, full of self-will, and consorting rather with fools than with the wise. Lastly, if we are to believe Guicciardini, who as an Italian might well have brought a somewhat partial judgment to bear upon the subject, a young man of little wit concerning the actions of men, but carried away by an ardent desire for rule and the acquisition of glory, a desire based far more on his shallow character and impetuosity than on any consciousness of genius. He was an enemy to all fatigue and all business, and when he tried to give his attention to it, he showed himself always totally wanting in prudence and judgment. If anything in him appeared at first sight to be worthy of praise, on a closer inspection it was found to be something nearer akin to vice than to virtue. He was liberal, it is true, but without thought, with no measure and no discrimination. He was sometimes inflexible in will, but this was through obstinacy rather than a constant mind, and what his flatterers called goodness deserved far more the name of insensibility to injuries or poverty of spirit. As to his physical appearance, if we are to believe the same author, it was still less admirable, and answered marvelously to his weakness of mind and character. He was small, with a large head, a short, thick neck, broad chest, and high shoulders. His thighs and legs were long and thin, and as his face also was ugly, and was only redeemed by the dignity and force of his glance, and all his limbs were disproportionate with one another, he had rather the appearance of a monster than a man. Such was he whom fortune was destined to make a conqueror, for whom heaven was reserving more glory than he had power to carry. So much for France. The imperial throne was occupied by Frederick III, who had been rightly named the Peaceful, not for the reason that he had always maintained peace, but because, having constantly been beaten, he had always been forced to make it. The first proof he had given of this very philosophical forbearance was during his journey to Rome, whither he betook himself to be consecrated. In crossing the Apennines, he was attacked by brigands. They robbed him, but he made no pursuit, and so, encouraged by example and by the impunity of lesser thieves, the greater ones soon took part in the robberies. Amurath seized part of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus took Lower Austria, and Frederick consoled himself for these usurpations by repeating the maxim, "Forgetfulness is the best cure for the losses we suffer." At the time we have now reached, he had just, after a reign of 53 years, affianced his son Maximilian to Marie of Burgundy, and had put under the ban of the empire his son-in-law, Albert of Bavaria, who laid claim to the ownership of the Tyrol. He was therefore too full of his family affairs to be troubled about Italy. Besides, he was busy looking for a motto for the House of Austria, an occupation of the highest importance for a man of the character of Frederick III. This motto, which Charles V was destined almost to render true, was at last discovered, to the great joy of the old emperor, who, judging that he had nothing more to do on earth after he had given this last proof of sagacity, died on the 19th of August, 1493, leaving the empire to his son Maximilian. This motto was simply founded on the 5 vowels A-E-I-O-U, the initial letters of these 5 words, Austriae est imperare orbi universo. This means, it is the destiny of Austria to rule over the whole world. So much for Germany. Now that we have cast a glance over the 4 nations which were on the way, as we said before, to become European powers, let us turn our attention to those secondary states which formed a circle more contiguous to Rome, and whose business it was to serve as armor, so to speak, to the spiritual queen of the world, should it please any of these political giants whom we have described to make encroachments with a view to an attack on the seas or the mountains, the Adriatic Gulf or the Alps, the Mediterranean or the Apennines. These were the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, the magnificent Republic of Florence, and the most serene Republic of Venice. The Kingdom of Naples was in the hands of the old Ferdinand, whose birth was not only illegitimate, but probably also well within the prohibited degree. His father, Alfonso of Aragon, received his crown from Giovanna of Naples, who had adopted him as her successor. But since, in the fear of having no heir, the queen on her deathbed had named 2 instead of 1, Alfonso had to sustain his rights against Renee. The 2 aspirants for some time disputed the crown. At last the House of Aragon carried the day over the House of Anjou, and in the course of the year 1442, Alfonso definitely secured his seat on the throne. Of this sort were the claims of the defeated rival, which we shall see Charles VIII maintaining later on. Ferdinand had neither the courage nor the genius of his father, and yet he triumphed over his enemies one after another. He had 2 rivals, both far superior in merit to himself. The one was his nephew, the Count of Viana, who, basing his claim on his uncle's shameful birth, commanded the whole Aragonese party. The other was Duke John of Calabria, who commanded the whole Angevin party. Still he managed to hold the 2 apart, and to keep himself on the throne by dint of his prudence, which often verged upon duplicity. He had a cultivated mind, and had studied the sciences, above all, law. He was of middle height, with a large handsome head, his brow open and admirably framed in beautiful white hair, which fell nearly down to his shoulders. Moreover, though he had rarely exercised his physical strength in arms, this strength was so great that one day, when he happened to be on the square of the Mercato Nuovo at Naples, he seized by the horns a bull that had escaped, and stopped him short, in spite of all the efforts the animal made to escape from his hands. Now the election of Alexander had caused him great uneasiness, and in spite of his usual prudence, he had not been able to restrain himself from saying before the bearer of the news that not only did he fail to rejoice in this election, but also that he did not think any Christian could rejoice in it, seeing that Borgia, having always been a bad man, would certainly make a bad pope. To this he added that even were the choice an excellent one, and such as would please everybody else, it would be none the less fatal to the House of Aragon, although Rodrigo was born her subject, and owed to her the origin and progress of his fortunes. For wherever reasons of state come in, the ties of blood and parentage are soon forgotten, and a fortiori, relations arising from the obligations of nationality. Thus one may see that Ferdinand judged Alexander VI with his usual perspicacity. This, however, did not hinder him, as we shall soon perceive, from being the first to contract an alliance with him. The Duchy of Milan belonged nominally to John Galeazzo, grandson of Francesco Sforza, who had seized it by violence on the 26th of February, 1450, and bequeathed it to his son, Galeazzo Maria, father of the young prince now reigning. We say nominally because the real master of the Milanese was at this period not the legitimate heir who was supposed to possess it, but his uncle Ludovico, surnamed Il Moro, because of the mulberry tree which he bore in his arms. After being exiled with his two brothers, Philip, who died of poison in 1479, and Ascanio, who became the cardinal, he returned to Milan some days after the assassination of Galeazzo Maria, which took place on the 26th of December, 1476, in St. Stephen's Church, and assumed the regency for the young duke, who at that time was only 8 years old. From now onward, even after his nephew had reached the age of 22, Ludovico continued to rule, and according to all probabilities was destined to rule a long time yet. For, some days after the poor young man had shown a desire to take the reins himself, he had fallen sick, and it was said, and not in a whisper, that he had taken one of those slow but mortal poisons of which princes made so frequent a use at this period that, even when a malady was natural, a cause was always sought connected with some great man's interests. However it may have been, Ludovico had relegated his nephew, now too weak to busy himself henceforward with the affairs of his duchy, to the castle of Pavia, where he lay and languished under the eyes of his wife Isabella, daughter of King Ferdinand of Naples. As to Ludovico, he was an ambitious man, full of courage and astuteness, familiar with the sword and with poison, which he used alternately according to the occasion, without feeling any repugnance or any predilection for either of them, but quite decided to be his nephew's heir, whether he died or lived. Florence, although she had preserved the name of a republic, had little by little lost all her liberties, and belonged in fact, if not by right, to Piero dei Medici, to whom she had been bequeathed as a paternal legacy by Lorenzo, as we have seen, at the risk of his soul's salvation. The son, unfortunately, was far from having the genius of his father. He was handsome, it is true, whereas Lorenzo, on the contrary, was remarkably ugly. He had an agreeable musical voice, whereas Lorenzo had always spoken through his nose. He was instructed in Latin and Greek, his conversation was pleasant and easy, and he improvised verses almost as well as the so-called magnificent. But he was both ignorant of political affairs, and haughtily insolent in his behavior to those who had made them their study. Added to this, he was an ardent lover of pleasure, passionately addicted to women, incessantly occupied with bodily exercises that should make him shine in their eyes, above all with tennis, a game at which he very highly excelled. He promised himself that, when the period of mourning was past, he would occupy the attention not only of Florence but of the whole of Italy by the splendor of his courts and the renown of his fêtes. Piero dei Medici had at any rate formed this plan, but heaven decreed otherwise. As to the most serene Republic of Venice, whose doge was Agostino Barbarigo, she had attained, at the time we have reached, to her highest degree of power and splendor. From Cadiz to the Palace Meotis, there was no port that was not open to her 1,000 ships. She possessed in Italy, beyond the coastline of the canals and the ancient Duchy of Venice, the provinces of Bergamo, Brescia, Crema, Verona, Vicenza, and Padua. She owned the marches of Treviso, which comprehend the districts of Feltre, Belluno, Cadore, Policella of Rovigo, and the Principality of Ravenna. She also owned the Friuli except Aquileia, Istria except Trieste. She owned on the east side of the Gulf Zara, Spalatra, and the shore of Albania. In the Ionian Sea, the islands of Zante and Corfu. In Greece, Lepanto and Patras. In the Morea, Moroni, Corone, Neapolis, and Argos. Lastly, in the archipelago, besides several little towns and stations on the coast, She owned Candia and the kingdom of Cyprus. Thus, from the mouth of the Po to the eastern extremity of the Mediterranean, the most serene republic was mistress of the whole coastline, and Italy and Greece seemed to be mere suburbs of Venice. In the intervals of space left free between Naples, Milan, Florence, and Venice, petty tyrants had arisen who exercised an absolute sovereignty over their territories. Thus the Colonnos were at Ostia and at Nettuno, the Montefeltri at Urbino, the Manfredi at Faenza, the Bentivogli at Bologna, the Malatesta family at Rimini, the Vitelli at Città di Castello, the Baglioni at Perugia, the Orsini at Vicovaro, and the princes of Este at Ferrara. Finally, in the center of this immense circle, composed of great powers, of secondary states, and of little tyrannies, Rome was set on high, the most exalted, yet the weakest of all, without influence, without lands, without an army, without gold. It was the concern of the new pope to secure all this. Let us see, therefore, what manner of man was this Alexander VI for undertaking and accomplishing such a project. End of section 4. Section 5, The Borgias, Chapter 3, Part 1. Rodrigo Lenzuolo was born at Valencia in Spain in 1430 or 1431, and on his mother's side was descended, as some writers declare, of a family of royal blood, which had cast its eyes on the tiara only after cherishing hopes of the crowns of Aragon and Valencia. Rodrigo from his infancy had shown signs of a marvelous quickness of mind, and as he grew older he exhibited an intelligence extremely apt for the study of sciences, especially law and jurisprudence. The result was that his first distinctions were gained in the law, a profession wherein he soon made a great reputation by his ability in the discussion of the most thorny cases. All the same, he was not slow to leave this career, and abandoned it quite suddenly for the military profession which his father had followed. But after various actions which served to display his presence of mind and courage, he was as much disgusted with this profession as with the other. And since it happened that at the very time he began to feel this disgust his father died, leaving a considerable fortune, he resolved to do no more work, but to live according to his own fancies and caprices. About this time he became the lover of a widow who had 2 daughters. The widow dying, Rodrigo took the girls under his protection, put one into a convent, and as the other was one of the loveliest women imaginable, made her his mistress. This was the notorious Rosa Venozza, by whom he had 5 children, Francesco, Cesar, Lucrezia, and Goffredo. The name of the 5th is unknown. Rodrigo, retired from public affairs, was given up entirely to the affections of a lover and a father, when he heard that his uncle, who loved him like a son, had been elected pope under the name of Calixtus III. But the young man was at this time so much a lover that love imposed silence on ambition, and indeed he was almost terrified at the exaltation of his uncle, which was no doubt destined to force him once more into public life. Consequently, instead of hurrying to Rome as anyone else in his place would have done, he was content to indite to His Holiness a letter in which he begged for the continuation of his favors and wished him a long and happy reign. This reserve on the part of one of his relatives, contrasted with the ambitious schemes which beset the new pope at every step, struck Calixtus III in a singular way. He knew the stuff that was in young Rodrigo, and at a time when he was besieged on all sides by mediocrities, this powerful nature, holding modestly aside, gained new grandeur in his eyes, so he replied instantly to Rodrigo that on the receipt of his letter he must quit Spain for Italy, Valencia for Rome. This letter uprooted Rodrigo from the center of happiness he had created for himself, and where he might perhaps have slumbered on like an ordinary man if fortune had not thus interposed to drag him forcibly away. Rodrigo was happy, Rodrigo was rich. The evil passions which were natural to him had been, if not extinguished, at least lulled. He was frightened himself at the idea of changing the quiet life he was leading for the ambitious, agitated career that was promised him, and instead of obeying his uncle, he delayed the preparations for departure, hoping that Calixtus would forget him. It was not so. 2 months after he received the letter from the Pope, there arrived at Valentia a prelate from Rome, the bearer of Rodrigo's nomination to a benefice worth 20,000 ducats a year, and also a positive order to the holder of the post to come and take possession of his charge as soon as possible. Holding back was no longer feasible, so Rodrigo obeyed. But as he did not wish to be separated from the source whence had sprung 8 years of happiness, Rosa Venozza also left Spain, and while he was going to Rome, she betook herself to Venice, accompanied by 2 confidential servants, and under the protection of a Spanish gentleman named Manuel Melchior. Fortune kept the promises she had made to Rodrigo. The Pope received him as a son, and made him successively Archbishop of Valencia, Cardinal Deacon, and Vice-Chancellor. To all these favors Calixtus added a revenue of 20,000 ducats, so that at the age of scarcely 35, Rodrigo found himself the equal of a prince in riches and power. Rodrigo had had some reluctance about accepting the cardinalship, which kept him fast at Rome, and would have preferred to be general of the Church, a position which would have allowed him more liberty for seeing his mistress and his family. But his uncle Calixtus made him reckon with the possibility of being his successor some day, and from that moment the idea of being the supreme head of kings and nations took such hold of Rodrigo that he no longer had any end in view but that which his uncle had made him entertain. From that day forward there began to grow up in the young cardinal that talent for hypocrisy which made of him the most perfect incarnation of the devil that has perhaps ever existed, and Rodrigo was no longer the same man. With words of repentance and humility on his lips, his head bowed as though he were bearing the weight of his past sins, disparaging the riches which he had acquired, and which, according to him, were the wealth of the poor and ought to return to the poor, he passed his life in churches, monasteries, and hospitals, acquiring, his historian tells us, even in the eyes of his enemies, the reputation of a Solomon for wisdom, of a Job for patience, and of a very Moses for his promulgation of the word of God. Rosa Venozza was the only person in the world who could appreciate the value of this pious cardinal's conversion. It proved a lucky thing for Rodrigo that he had assumed this pious attitude, for his protector died after a reign of 3 years, 3 months, and 19 days, and he was now sustained by his own merit alone against the numerous enemies he had made by his rapid rise to fortune. So, during the whole of the reign of Pius II, he lived always apart from public affairs, and only reappeared in the days of Sixtus IV, who made him the gift of the abbacy of Subiaco, and sent him in the capacity of ambassador to the kings of Aragon and Portugal. On his return, which took place during the pontificate of Innocent VIII, he decided to fetch his family at last to Rome. Thither they came, escorted by Don Manuel Melchior, who from that moment passed as the husband of Rosa Venozza, and took the name of Count Ferdinand of Castile. The Cardinal Rodrigo received the noble Spaniard as a countryman and a friend, and he, who expected to lead a most retired life, engaged a house in the street of the Lungara, near the church of Regina Caeli, on the banks of the Tiber. There it was that, after passing the day in prayers and pious works, Cardinal Rodrigo used to repair each evening and lay aside his mask. And it was said, though nobody could prove it, that in this house infamous scenes passed. Report said the dissipations were of so dissolute a character that their equals had never been seen in Rome. With a view to checking the rumors that began to spread abroad, Rodrigo sent Cesar to study in Pisa, and married Lucretia to a young gentleman of Aragon. Thus there only remained at home Rosa Venozza and her 2 sons, Such was the state of things when Innocent VIII died, and Rodrigo Borgia was proclaimed Pope. We have seen by what means the nomination was effected, and so the 5 cardinals who had taken no part in this simony, namely the Cardinals of Naples, Sierra, Portugal, Santa Maria in Portico, and St. Peter in Vinculus, protested loudly against this election, which they treated as a piece of jobbery. But Rodrigo had none the less, however it was done, secured his majority. Rodrigo was none the less the 260th successor of St. Peter. Alexander VI, however, though he had arrived at his object, did not dare throw off at first the mask which the Cardinal Borgia had worn so long, although when he was apprised of his election he could not dissimulate his joy. Indeed, on hearing the favorable result of the scrutiny, he lifted his hands to heaven and cried, in the accents of satisfied ambition, "Am I then Pope? Am I then Christ's vicar? Am I then the keystone of the Christian world?" "Yes, Holy Father," replied Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, the same who had sold to Rodrigo the 9 votes that were at his disposal at the conclave for 4 mules laden with silver. "And we hope by our election to give glory to God, repose to the Church, and joy to Christendom, seeing that you have been chosen by the Almighty Himself as the most worthy among all your brethren." But in the short interval occupied by this reply, the new Pope had already assumed papal authority, and in a humble voice, and with hands crossed upon his breast, he spoke. "We hope that God will grant us His powerful aid, in spite of our weakness, and that He will do for us that which He did for the Apostle, when aforetime He put into his hands the keys of heaven, and entrusted to him the government of the Church, a government which, without the aid of God, would prove too heavy a burden for mortal man. But God promised that His Spirit should direct him. God will do the same, I trust, for us, and for your part we fear not lest any of you fail in that holy obedience which is due unto the head of the Church, even as the flock of Christ was bidden to follow the Prince of the Apostles." Having spoken these words, Alexander donned the pontifical robes, and through the windows of the Vatican had strips of paper thrown out, on which his name was written in Latin. These, blown by the wind, seemed to convey to the whole world the news of the great event which was about to change the face of Italy. The same day, couriers started for all the courts of Europe. Cesare Borgia learned the news of his father's election at the University of Pisa, where he was a student. His ambition had sometimes dreamed of such good fortune, yet his joy was little short of madness. He was then a young man, about 22 or 24 years of age, skillful in all bodily exercises, and especially in fencing. He could ride barebacked the most fiery of steeds, could cut off the head of a bull at a single sword stroke. Moreover, he was arrogant, jealous, and insincere. According to Tomasi, he was great among the godless, as his brother Francesco was good among the great. As to his face, even contemporary authors have left utterly different descriptions, for some have painted him as a monster of ugliness, while others, on the contrary, extol his beauty. This contradiction is due to the fact that at certain times of the year, and especially in the spring, his face was covered with an eruption which, so long as it lasted, made him an object of horror and disgust, while all the rest of the year he was the somber, black-haired cavalier with pale skin and tawny beard, whom Raphael shows us in the fine portrait he made of him. And historians, both chroniclers and painters, agree as to his fixed and powerful gaze, behind which burned a ceaseless flame, giving to his face something infernal and superhuman. Such was the man whose fortune was to fulfill all his desires. He had taken for his motto, Aut Caesar, aut nihil, Caesar, or nothing. End of Section 5. Section 6, The Borgias, Chapter 3, Part 2. Caesar posted to Rome with certain of his friends, and scarcely was he recognized at the gates of the city, when the deference shown to him gave instant proof of the change in his fortunes. At the Vatican the respect was twice as great. Mighty men bowed down before him as before one mightier than themselves. And so, in his impatience, he stayed not to visit his mother or any other member of his family, but went straight to the Pope to kiss his feet. And as the Pope had been forewarned of his coming, he awaited him in the midst of a brilliant and numerous assemblage of cardinals, with the 3 other brothers standing behind him. His Holiness received Cæsar with a gracious countenance. Still, he did not allow himself any demonstration of his paternal love, but, bending towards him, kissed him on the forehead and inquired how he was and how he had fared on his journey. Cæsar replied that he was wonderfully well and altogether at the service of his Holiness, that as to the journey, the trifling inconveniences and short fatigue had been compensated, and far more than compensated, by the joy which he felt in being able to adore upon the papal throne a pope who was so worthy. At these words, leaving Cæsar still on his knees and reseating himself, for he had risen from his seat to embrace him, the Pope assumed a grave and composed expression of face, and spoke as follows, loud enough to be heard by all, and slowly enough for everyone present to be able to ponder and retain in his memory even the least of his words. "We are convinced, Cæsar, that you are peculiarly rejoiced in beholding us on this sublime height, so far above our deserts, whereto it has pleased the divine goodness to exalt us. This joy of yours is first of all our due because of the love we have always borne you, and which we bear you still. And in the second place is prompted by your own personal interest, since henceforth you may feel sure of receiving from our pontifical hand those benefits which your own good works shall deserve. But if your joy, and this we say to you as we have even now said to your brothers, if your joy is founded on aught else than this, you are very greatly mistaken, Cæsar, and you will find yourself sadly deceived. Perhaps we have been ambitious. We confess this humbly before the face of all men, passionately and immoderately ambitious to attain to the dignity of sovereign pontiff. And to reach this end, we have followed every path that is open to human industry. But we have acted thus, vowing an inward vow that when once we had reached our goal, we would follow no other path but that which conduces best to the service of God and to the advancement of the Holy See, so that the glorious memory of the deeds that we shall do may efface the shameful recollection of the deeds we have already done. Thus shall we, let us hope, leave to those who follow us a track, whereupon if they find not the footsteps of a saint, they may at least tread in the path of a true pontiff. God, who has furthered the means, claims at our hands the fruits, and we desire to discharge to the full this mighty debt that we have incurred to him. And accordingly, we refuse to arouse by any deceit the stern rigor of his judgments. One sole hindrance could have power to shake our good intentions, and that might happen should we feel too keen an interest in your fortunes. Therefore are we armed beforehand against our love, and therefore have we prayed to God beforehand that we stumble not because of you. For in the path of favoritism a pope cannot slip without a fall, and cannot fall without injury and dishonor to the Holy See. Even to the end of our life we shall deplore the faults which have brought this experience home to us, and may it please God that our Uncle Calixtus of blessed memory bear not this day in purgatory the burden of our sins, more heavy, alas, than his own. Ah, he was rich in every virtue, he was full of good intentions, but he loved too much his own people, and among them he loved me chief. And so he suffered this love to lead him blindly astray, all this love that he bore to his kindred, who to him were too truly flesh of his flesh, so that he heaped upon the heads of a few persons only, and those perhaps the least worthy, benefits which would more fittingly have rewarded the deserts of many. In truth, he bestowed upon our house treasures that should never have been amassed at the expense of the poor, or else should have been turned to a better purpose. He severed from the ecclesiastical state, already weak and poor, the duchy of Spoleto and other wealthy properties, that he might make them fiefs to us. He confided to our weak hands the vice-chancellorship, the vice-prefecture of Rome, the generalship of the Church, and all the other most important offices which, instead of being monopolized by us, should have been conferred on those who were most meritorious. Moreover, there were persons who were raised on our recommendation to posts of great dignity, although they had no claims but such as our undue partiality accorded them. Others were left out with no reason for their failure except the jealousy excited in us by their virtues. To rob Ferdinand of Aragon of the kingdom of Naples, Calixtus kindled a terrible war, which by a happy issue only served to increase our fortune, and by an unfortunate issue must have brought shame and disaster upon the Holy See. Lastly, by allowing himself to be governed by men who sacrificed public good to their private interests, he inflicted an injury not only upon the pontifical throne and his own reputation, but what is far worse, far more deadly, upon his own conscience. And yet, O wise judgments of God, hard and incessantly though he toiled to establish our fortunes, scarcely had he left empty that supreme seat which we occupy today, when we were cast down from the pinnacle whereon we had climbed, abandoned to the fury of the rabble and the vindictive hatred of the Roman barons, who chose to feel offended by our goodness to their enemies. Thus, not only, we tell you, Caesar, not only did we plunge headlong from the summit of our grandeur, losing the worldly goods and dignities which our uncle had heaped at our feet, but for very peril of our life we were condemned to a voluntary exile, we and our friends, and in this way only did we contrive to escape the storm which our too good fortune had stirred up against us. Now this is a plain proof that God mocks at men's designs when they are bad ones. How great an error is it for any pope to devote more care to the welfare of a house, which cannot last more than a few years, than to the glory of the Church, which will last forever. What utter folly for any public man whose position is not inherited and cannot be bequeathed to his posterity, to support the edifice of his grandeur on any other basis than the noblest virtue practiced for the general good, and to suppose that he can ensure the continuance of his own fortune otherwise than by taking all precautions against sudden whirlwinds which are wont to arise in the midst of a calm, and to blow up the storm clouds, I mean the host of enemies. Now any one of these enemies who does his worst can cause injuries far more powerful than any help that is at all likely to come from 100 friends and their lying promises. If you and your brothers walk in the path of virtue which we shall now open for you, every wish of your heart shall be instantly accomplished. But if you take the other path, if you have ever hoped that our affection will wink at disorderly life, then you will very soon find out that we are truly Pope, Father of the Church, not father of the family, that, vicar of Christ as we are, we shall act as we deem best for Christendom.